Hi, welcome to another episode of the Lens blog. This one comes from Australia, where my wife and I are visiting for personal family reasons. Now, Australia operates a military-style quarantine scheme, and any visitors have to be isolated in quarantine for 14 days. And this is day 12 of our quarantine, and we're doing this blog. Now, we had heard various horror stories about the quarantine experience, and we had more or less assumed we were going to get the equivalent of a modern day Australian penal colony experience. But I have to say, actually, on the ground, the reality has been very different for us in Queensland. The officials at all stages of the process and the staff that we've dealt with have been incredibly understanding, tolerant, and empathetic. And as you can see, rather than a prison cell, we have a room at Surfers Paradise with a balcony overlooking the sea. So those things have defied our expectations. But actually, you are still a prisoner. You get your meals dropped off 3 times a day, and the only thing you're allowed to do is put a mask on and put your hand outside your door and bring them in. That sense of confinement takes its psychological toll. But the worst thing is the fear that any time during the process, you or your partner or the people who sat near you on the plane test positive, well, those individuals are hauled off to hospital and your quarantine process resets at 0. And that's the fear that sort of takes hold, and you worry, and you can't really enjoy actually what is pretty good food and great weather and great views, because you're not in control of your own destiny. Now, my wife and I have had 3 separate calls from Queensland health officials inquiring about our well-being. And I've spoken to them and said, why are you, in a sense, phoning up so much? And they say, well, actually, people find this really, really difficult. The fear that's created, the uncertainty that's created, and in fact, a lot of people suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome. One of the ways that I found to deal with it is to do a 4K run every day in my hotel room, would you believe? I've worked out a way of doing it. I've also calculated that I've done 1.5 marathons here in my hotel room, and that really helps bring down anxiety and fear and that sense of confinement. But the other thing I want to talk about is how this psychology of fear might play out in countries like Australia, New Zealand, and China, which have adopted a zero COVID strategy. Now, undoubtedly, that strategy has worked. They have controlled their borders very severely. Every single case is followed up really severely. So in the national media, any community transmission is aired widely, the places that person visited, and people rush to get themselves tested and screened. Now, that has all been brilliant so far for these countries. But how do you rejoin planet Earth as the rest of the world emerges out of the COVID crisis? The vaccination programs in these countries are behind schedule. A lot of people don't feel that motivated to engage in the vaccines because of the risk entailed and because life is normal here. And also, politicians have leapt over themselves to talk about the importance of really exerting draconian control over any cases of COVID. But if you open up and rejoin the world, it can't be done in a risk-free way. You have to entertain some sort of risk. And this is where the psychology of fear takes in. Fear is at the very foundation of the Maslow hierarchy. And when it takes hold, it's really hard to dislodge. And I think the politicians and the media will need to work very, very hard to dislodge that here. Because the economies in these countries will suffer for not re-engaging with the world. Tourism, higher education, resources requires interaction with the outside world. And Australia and other countries will suffer from that. There's a degree of smugness in these places as they look at the rest of the world, the US, Europe, the other countries, and look at the horror story that they deem to be playing out there. But there is a phase 2 to this crisis, which is now emerging. And these countries will find that phase much harder than some of the countries that they're looking at with horror. Unless that reality is grasped and preparations start now, and the population is psychologically prepared to re-engage, Australia may turn out to be a bit like this room. It's lovely and the experience is great, but how do you get out of it? Thank you for listening to this blog, and we'll see you next time.